I always thought family meant unconditional love, that parents cherished every sacrifice their children made for them. Then my mother looked me in the eyes and asked, "Why should we invite you to our anniversary?" The anniversary celebration. I had spent 6 months secretly funding down to the last detail. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning my parents announced their plans for their 30th anniversary started like any other Sunday. The spring sunlight streamed through my apartment windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors I had meticulously restored myself. I had just finished my weekly ritual of brewing fresh coffee and settling in with my laptop to pay bills when the familiar chime of a video call interrupted my routine. I smiled when I saw my parents' names flash across my screen. These Sunday. Calls had become our tradition after I moved to Portland 3 years ago for the marketing director position I'd worked so hard to land. Despite the physical distance between us, I made every effort to remain connected to them, to be the devoted daughter I had always been. "Emma!" My mom's voice rang out as her face filled my screen, my father's appearing moments later beside her. Their home in Minneapolis looked the same as always. The floral wallpaper they'd never updated, the collection of framed family photos arranged meticulously on the shelf behind them. "How's our girl doing?" "I'm good, Mom," I replied, taking a sip of my coffee. "How are you two doing?" "Dad, how's your back feeling after the yard work last weekend?" My father waved dismissively. "Oh, it's fine. Nothing to worry about." That was my dad, Marcus Bennett, always downplaying anything that might suggest weakness or vulnerability. A retired electrical engineer who had spent 35 years at the same company, he approached life with the same precision and practicality he had applied to his work. Every problem had a solution. Every challenge could be overcome with enough analysis and effort. Mom, Diana to everyone but her closest friends who still called her Dee, had been an elementary school teacher for 28 years. She had the unique ability to make everyone feel special while simultaneously maintaining impossibly high standards. Her approval had always been something I strived for, sometimes to my own detriment. "We actually have some exciting news," my mother continued, her eyes brightening. She glanced at my father, who nodded encouragingly. "We've decided to have a proper celebration for our 30th anniversary this year." I straightened up, genuinely pleased. My parents rarely did anything extravagant for themselves. "That's wonderful. What are you thinking of doing?" "Well," my mother said, her voice taking on that slightly higher pitch it always did when she was truly excited about something, "we're thinking of having a proper party, renting out the Lakeview room at the Grand Hotel downtown, having a nice dinner, maybe even a little dancing." The Grand Hotel was one of the most expensive venues in Minneapolis. I raised my eyebrows, surprised by their choice. My parents had always been frugal, a trait that had intensified after my father's retirement. "That sounds amazing," I said, genuinely happy for them. "The Grand is beautiful. When are you thinking of having it?" "June 18th, my father replied. "That's our actual anniversary date this year." I quickly calculated in my head, just over 3 months away. Not a lot of time to plan an event at a venue like the Grand, which typically booked out far in advance. And then there was the matter of cost. My father's pension was decent, and they'd always been good with savings, but an event at the Grand would be a significant expense. "Have you already looked into availability? Those places book up fast," I asked, trying to sound casual. My mother's smile faltered slightly, Well, we've made a preliminary inquiry, but she trailed off, glancing at my father. It's more than we anticipated. My father finished for her, his voice matter of fact. The quote they gave us was quite steep, especially with all the extras. There it was. I could hear the resignation in his voice, the subtle shift that told me they were already preparing to scale back their dreams, to settle for something less than what they truly wanted. It was a pattern I'd observed my entire life. My parents, sacrificing their own desires, often for my benefit. I thought about all they had given me over the years. The extra shifts my father had taken to pay for my dance lessons when I was young. The countless hours my mother had spent helping me with college applications and essays. The way they had both supported me through my messy breakup with Ryan 2 years ago, flying out to Portland to help me put my life back together when I could barely get out of bed. In that moment, I made a decision. Don't worry about that right now, I said, keeping my tone light. It's your 30th anniversary. You deserve to celebrate exactly how you want to. Why don't you give me the contact information for the grand? I have a friend in event planning. Maybe she can help negotiate a better rate. This wasn't entirely untrue. I did have a college friend who worked in event planning, though not in Minneapolis. But I had no intention of asking for her help. Instead, I had begun formulating a plan, a way to give back to my parents, to show them how much I appreciated everything they had done for me. They exchanged a look, that silent communication that comes from 3 decades of marriage. That would be wonderful, honey, my mother said, her smile returning. But we don't want you to go to any trouble. We can always do something simpler. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It's no trouble at all, I insisted. Just send me the details, and I'll see what I can do. After they gave me the contact information and we chatted for a while longer about neighborhood gossip and my recent promotion, we said our goodbyes. As soon as the call ended, I pulled up my banking app and checked my savings account. The promotion I'd received 3 months ago had come with a substantial raise, and I'd been setting aside money for a down payment on a condo. There was enough there to cover what I was planning, not just to help, but to fund the entire celebration. The next morning, I called the Grand Hotel and introduced myself as Diana Bennett's daughter, inquiring about the Lakeview room for June 18th. The events coordinator, a woman named Vanessa with a warm, efficient manner, confirmed that the room was still available but acknowledged it was one of their most requested venues. Your parents have excellent taste, she said. The Lakeview room has panoramic views of the city and the lake. It's perfect for an anniversary celebration. Could you send me a detailed quote for what they discussed? I asked. I'd like to help them with the planning. The figure Vanessa emailed me an hour later made me wince despite my preparation. It included the room rental, a premium dinner package for 50 guests, an open bar for 4 hours, floral arrangements, and a professional photographer. No wonder my parents had been hesitant. Without allowing myself to overthink it, I replied to Vanessa's email. This looks perfect. I'll be handling all the arrangements and payments for my parents' anniversary. I'd like to keep this as a surprise for them, so I would appreciate your discretion. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into planning the perfect anniversary celebration for my parents. During my lunch breaks, after work, and on weekends, I coordinated with Vanessa on every detail. We selected linens in my mother's favorite shade of blue, arranged for a cake that replicated their original wedding design, and hired a string quartet to play the song they had first danced to at their wedding. I made the initial deposit from my savings account setting up a payment plan for the remaining balance. Each time I transferred money, I felt a strange mix of emotions: pride in being able to do this for them, determination to create the perfect event, and a tiny, almost imperceptible flutter of resentment that I quickly suppressed. This was my choice, I reminded myself. No one was forcing me to spend my savings this way. Meanwhile, I maintained the charade that I was simply helping with negotiations. On our Sunday calls, I would share carefully edited updates with my parents. Good news! The event planner was able to work out a discount on the floral arrangements, I'd say. Or, we've managed to find a photographer who's offering a special rate. My mother would exclaim over each piece of news, her excitement growing as the event took shape. My father, more perceptive, occasionally gave me searching looks. "Emma, you're not putting yourself out for this, are you?" he asked during one call. "We appreciate your help, but we don't want this to be a burden." "Dad, it's no burden," I assured him, the lie coming easily. "I'm happy to help. It's your 30th anniversary. It should be special." By the end of May, everything was arranged. I had paid 80% of the total cost, with the final payment due the week before the event. My savings account was significantly depleted, and I had put off my plans to look for a condo, but I told myself it was worth it. The joy on my parents' faces when they experienced the celebration I had created would make every sacrifice worthwhile. It was during this time that I began to notice subtle changes in my conversations with my parents. They talked increasingly about the guests they were inviting: old friends from their college days, my father's former co-workers, neighbors they had known for decades. They discussed seating arrangements and which relatives might not get along, all with an enthusiasm that warmed my heart. But oddly, they never mentioned my role in the event. Beyond thanking me for my help with planning, they didn't talk about where I would sit or what I would wear or who I might want to catch up with. I brushed off this observation, assuming they thought these details were obvious. Of course I would be there. I was their daughter, their only child. The first real hint that something was amiss came 4 weeks before the event. I had taken a Friday off work to fly to Minneapolis for a supposed business trip. Actually, a secret visit to finalize details with Vanessa at the Grand. The meeting went perfectly. The venue was even more beautiful than the pictures. The menu tasting confirmed my selections, and Vanessa assured me that everything was on schedule. Feeling accomplished, I decided to surprise my parents with an impromptu visit. I stopped by a local bakery to pick up my mother's favorite pastries and drove to their house, anticipating their delight at seeing me unexpectedly. I used my key to let myself in, calling out as I entered, "Mom! Dad! Surprise!" I found them in the dining room, the table covered with papers, what appeared to be guest lists, seating charts, and notes. My mother looked up, genuine shock on her face. "Emma, what are you doing here? Why didn't you tell us you were coming?" I held up the bakery box. "I had a quick business trip and thought I'd surprise you. Brought your favorite eclairs." My father stood to greet me with a hug, but I couldn't help noticing how quickly my mother gathered up the papers on the table, stacking them messily and turning them face down. "This is wonderful," my father said, but there was something forced in his tone, a slight tension that hadn't been there in our video calls. "How long are you in town?" "Just until tomorrow afternoon," I replied, my eyes drawn to the papers my mother was still trying to organize. I caught a glimpse of what looked like a seating chart before she slid it into a folder. "I thought maybe we could have dinner together tonight." "Oh," my mother said, glancing at my father. "We actually have plans tonight. The Wilsons invited." us over for dinner. We didn't know you'd be here." "That's okay," I said quickly, pushing down a flicker of disappointment. "It was last minute. I should have called." An awkward silence fell, something rare in our usually comfortable relationship. To fill it, I gestured toward the folder. "Working on anniversary plans? Need any help while I'm here?" My mother's hand rested protectively on the folder. No, we've got it under control. Just finalizing the guest list and seating arrangements. You've already been so helpful with the venue." Something in her tone made me pause. There was a hesitation there, a careful selection of words that felt unnatural. "Can I see what you've got so far?" I asked, reaching for the folder with a casual smile. "Maybe I can help with the seating chart. I know how Aunt Judith feels about being too close to Uncle Robert since the divorce." My mother slid the folder slightly away from my reach, her movement so subtle it might have been unconscious. "It's still very rough. We'll send you the final version once it's done." "Send me the final version?" That was an odd way to phrase it, as if I were just another guest rather than someone who would be helping with the preparations on the day. My father, always the peacemaker, broke the tension. "Those eclairs look delicious. Why don't we have some with coffee? You can tell us about your business trip." We moved to the kitchen, and the moment passed. We spent the afternoon catching up, carefully avoiding any detailed discussion of the anniversary plans. I left the next day with a nagging sense of discomfort I couldn't quite name. 2 weeks later, the final payment for the grand was due. I transferred the remaining amount, a sum that effectively emptied my savings account, and felt a surge of both pride and anxiety. It was done. I had successfully funded my parents' dream anniversary celebration without them knowing. In just 2 more weeks, they would discover my surprise, and all the secrecy and financial sacrifice would be worth it. That same evening, I received an email from my mother with the subject line, "Anniversary Updates." Expecting to see the finalized guest list or perhaps some question about the arrangements, I opened it immediately. Instead, I found a formal electronic invitation to my parents' 30th anniversary celebration sent through one of those online event platforms. It was beautifully designed, with a recent photo of my parents and all the correct details of the event I had arranged. At the bottom was a link to RSVP and a note that read, "We hope you can join us for this special occasion." I stared at my screen, confused. Why would they send me an invitation to an event I was helping to plan? Was this their attempt at maintaining the fiction that they were organizing everything themselves? But the wording, "We hope you can join us," suggested something else entirely, something I didn't want to consider. With growing unease, I clicked the RSVP link and saw that they had created a complete guest list. I scrolled through the names, relatives, friends, colleagues, mentally checking them against the count we had given to the grand. And then I saw it, or rather didn't see it. My name wasn't on the list. My first thought was that it must be a mistake. Of course, they wouldn't need to include me on a formal guest list. I was their daughter, the person who was secretly funding the entire event. I was implicit in the planning. But as I continued to examine the invitation and the guest list, doubt crept in. The tone was formal, detached, not the way one would communicate with someone deeply involved in the event. And why send an invitation at all if they assumed I would be there? I picked up my phone and called my mother, my heart racing unexpectedly. "Mom, I just got your email with the anniversary invitation." "Oh, good," she replied, sounding pleased. "Isn't it lovely? Your father's co-worker's daughter designed it for us. She does graphic design." "It's beautiful," I said carefully, but I'm a little confused. Why did you send me a formal invitation? There was a pause, just a beat too long. Well, we're sending them to everyone, honey. It's proper etiquette. I know, but I hesitated, suddenly feeling foolish. I assumed I would be helping with the event, not just attending as a guest. And actually, my name isn't on the guest list at all. Another pause, longer this time. I heard my father's voice in the background, asking a question I couldn't make out. My mother's muffled response, then she was back on the line. "Oh, that must be an oversight," she said, her voice overly bright. "Of course you're invited, Emma. We'll fix the guest list right away." Relief washed over me, followed immediately by confusion. An oversight? How could they create a complete guest list and simply forget to include their only child? "Great," I said, trying to match her light tone. "So what time should I arrive that day to help set up? I can come early to make sure everything is perfect before the guests arrive." The silence that followed was deafening. "Well," my mother finally said, her voice careful, measured, "we've actually hired people to handle all of that. The grandee has a wonderful staff, and they'll take care of everything. You don't need to worry about helping." "I don't mind," I pressed. "I'd like to be there to make sure everything goes according to plan." "Emma," my mother said, a new firmness in her voice, "this is our anniversary celebration. We've arranged it the way we want it. You don't need to take over." "Take over?" The phrase stung. How could I take over an event I had created? "I'm not trying to take over," I said, struggling to keep my voice even. "I just thought—" "We appreciate all your help with the negotiations," she interrupted, "but we want to handle the actual day ourselves. You can just come and enjoy as a guest, like everyone else." Like everyone else. The words echoed in my head. Not as their daughter, not as someone special, just like everyone else. "Mom," I said slowly, "I think we're having a miscommunication here. I didn't just help with negotiations. I've been planning this entire event. I've been working with Vanessa at the Grand for months." "Vanessa?" My mother sounded genuinely confused. "Who's Vanessa?" "The event coordinator at the Grand," I explained, my unease growing. "The person I've been arranging everything with." "That's not possible," my mother said. "We've been working with someone named Michael. He's been our contact from the beginning." Now it was my turn to be confused. "From the beginning?" "Mom, what exactly do you think I've been doing these past few months when I've been updating you on the plans?" "Helping us get discounts, like you said," she replied, sounding increasingly impatient. "Negotiating better rates because of your friend in event planning. Emma, we appreciate that, but the anniversary is our event. We've been planning it ourselves." The reality of the situation began to dawn on me. A cold realization that made my chest tighten. They had no idea what I had done. They thought they were planning and paying for their own anniversary celebration, completely unaware that I had secretly arranged and funded everything. "Mom," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "who do you think is paying for the event at the Grand?" "What do you mean?" she asked, confusion evident in her tone. "We are, of course. Your father and I have been saving for this. It's our anniversary." I closed my eyes, trying to process what was happening. Through some extraordinary miscommunication, my parents believed they were planning and paying for an event that I had actually arranged and completely funded. They had been making plans, creating guest lists, and apparently even dealing with Someone named Michael, all while I had been working with Vanessa and transferring thousands of dollars from my savings account. "Mom," I said carefully, "I think we need to have a conversation in person. This is too complicated for a phone call." "There's nothing complicated about it," she replied, her voice taking on an edge I rarely heard. "We're having our anniversary celebration at the Grand on June 18th. We've sent you an invitation, and we hope you'll attend. That's all there is to it." "It's not that simple," I insisted, frustration beginning to build. "Mom, Emma," she cut me off. "Why is this so difficult? It's our anniversary. We're celebrating the way we want to. If you don't want to come just as a guest, that's your choice. But that's what we're offering." The words hit me like a physical blow. If I didn't want to come just as a guest? To the event I had created and funded? To the celebration of my own parents' marriage? "Are you saying you don't want me there?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could stop. My voice small and hurt. The silence that followed was answer enough, but my mother eventually spoke, her voice tight. "That's not what I said, Emma. Of course we want you there. But as a guest, not as whatever role you're trying to create for yourself." I felt as though I was falling, the ground beneath me suddenly gone. "What does that mean? What role do you think I'm trying to create?" She sighed heavily. "You've always done this, Emma. You take over. You decide you know better than everyone else what should happen, how things should be done. This is our anniversary. Ours. Not everything has to revolve around you and your ideas." Her words left me breathless. Was that how they saw me? As someone who took over, who made everything about herself? When all I had ever tried to do was help, to give back, to show my appreciation? "I see," I said finally, my voice hollow. "Well, thank you for the invitation. I'll think about it." "Emma," she began, but I'd already ended the call. I sat in my apartment, staring at nothing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. How had my generous gesture, my attempt to give my parents the celebration they deserved, turned into this? How had I become the uninvited guest at an event I was paying for? The worst part wasn't the money, though the financial impact was significant. It wasn't even the misunderstanding, though that was baffling in its completeness. The worst part was realizing that my parents saw my involvement not as a gift, but as an intrusion. That they would rather plan a celebration themselves, one they thought they were paying for, than accept what they perceived as my interference. I picked up my phone again, intending to call Vanessa at the Grand, to understand how this parallel planning could have occurred. But before I could make the call, a text from my father appeared. "Emma, please don't be upset. We just want a simple celebration with friends and family. Why not come next weekend instead? We can have dinner, just the three of us." Just the three of us, after they celebrated with everyone else, as an afterthought. I put my phone down without responding, a heavy weight settling in my chest. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full extent of my hurt and confusion. What had happened to the close family I thought we were? When had I become someone my parents wanted to keep at arm's length rather than embrace? And most pressingly, what was I going to do about the anniversary celebration I had planned and paid for, but apparently wasn't welcome to fully participate in? The morning after my devastating call with my mother, I woke up with swollen eyes and a sense of resolve that had solidified overnight. The initial shock had given way to something harder, more determined. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them through another frustrating phone conversation. I called my boss, requested an emergency personal day, and booked the first available flight to Minneapolis. By noon, I was 30,000 feet above the Midwest, staring out the airplane window at endless stretches of farmland, trying to organize my thoughts. What exactly had happened? How could my parents and I have been planning the same event without realizing it? And more importantly, why didn't they want me fully involved in their celebration? The questions circled in my mind like vultures, picking at my confidence, my understanding of my family dynamic, and my sense of self. Had I always been the controlling daughter they described? Had my attempts to help throughout my life been seen as interference rather than support? When the plane landed, I rented a car and drove straight to the Grand Hotel. I needed to understand the logistical confusion before confronting my parents. The elegant lobby was quiet in the middle of a weekday afternoon, and the receptionist directed me to the events office without question. Vanessa looked up from her computer with a warm smile when I entered. "Emma, what a lovely surprise. I didn't know you were coming to town." Her expression faltered as she took in my appearance, the hastily packed overnight bag, the wrinkled clothes from my rushed journey, the unmistakable signs of someone who had recently been crying. "Is everything all right? Has there been a change to the plans?" "Vanessa," I said, sinking into the chair across from her desk, "I need you to help me understand something. Have my parents been in contact with you directly about their anniversary celebration?" She frowned, clearly confused. "No, not at all. As you requested, I've kept all communication strictly between us. In fact, I've had to politely deflect a few calls from venues they were considering before settling on the Grand, explaining that the date was already booked without revealing who had booked it." I felt simultaneously relieved and more confused. "So they haven't been working with anyone named Michael here?" "Michael?" Vanessa shook her head. "No, there's no Michael in our events department. It's just myself and Thomas has been on paternity leave for the past month." I sat back, processing this information. So, if my parents think they've been working with someone named Michael on their anniversary, then they've been working with a different venue entirely, Vanessa finished for me, her eyes widening as she realized the implication. "Oh dear. Emma, do you think there's been some kind of mix-up?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I need to find out. Can you print me a copy of all the arrangements we've made? The contract, payment records, everything." 20 minutes later, I left the Grand with a folder full of documentation, proof of every payment I'd made, every decision I'd confirmed, every detail I'd arranged for my parents' special day. The confusion was only deepening. If my parents thought they were planning their own anniversary at the Grand but were actually working with someone at a different venue, where did they think all the information I'd been sharing with them was coming from? I drove to my parents' house with a strange sense of detachment, as if I were watching someone else's life unravel rather than my own. The familiar streets of my childhood passed by in a blur until I pulled into their driveway, noting absently that both their cars were there. At least I wouldn't have to track them down separately. I sat in the rental car for several minutes, gathering my courage. Part of me wanted to drive away, to pretend none of this was happening. But I had never been one to avoid difficult conversations, even when every instinct screamed at me to run. Finally, clutching the folder from the Grand, I approached the front door and rang the bell rather than using my key. This wasn't a casual visit. This was a confrontation. My father answered, his initial smile of greeting fading quickly to concern when he saw my expression. "Emma, what are you doing here? Is everything okay?" "We need to talk," I said simply, stepping past him into the house. "Where's Mom?" "In the kitchen," he replied, his brow furrowed. "Emma, what's going on? Your mother told me about your call last night, but I didn't think that I'd actually show up to get straight answers." I finished for him, already heading toward the kitchen. Well, here I am. My mother was at the kitchen island, sorting through mail. She looked up, startled, when I entered. "Emma, what on earth? Who's Michael?" I interrupted, placing the folder on the counter between us. She blinked, caught off guard by the directness of my question. "What?" "Michael," I repeated. "The person you said you've been working with at the Grand for your anniversary celebration. Who is he?" My parents exchanged a quick glance, the kind of silent communication that comes from decades of marriage. My father moved to stand beside my mother, presenting a united front. "He's our event coordinator," my father said carefully. "Why are you asking?" I opened the folder and spread out the documents. The contract with the Grand Hotel for the Lakeview Room on June 18th, signed by me. The payment receipts showing transfers from my account. The detailed arrangements for food, music, decor, all confirmed through Vanessa. "Because there is no Michael at the Grand," I said quietly. "There's Vanessa, who I've been working with for months, and Thomas, who's on paternity leave. And according to Vanessa, my parents haven't been in direct contact with the Grand at all." The color drained from my mother's face as she stared at the documents. My father leaned forward, examining the payment receipts with growing confusion. "I don't understand," he said, looking up at me. "These payments, these are from your account." "Yes," I confirmed. "Every single one. I've paid for the entire celebration at the Grand, the venue, the food, the music, the photographer, all of it." "But that's not possible," my mother protested, her voice faint. "We've been planning our anniversary at the Riverside Manor. We've been working with Michael Thompson there for months." The Riverside Manor, an entirely different venue across town. Suddenly, the parallel planning made sense. We had been arranging two completely different events. "So, when I told you I was negotiating with the Grand," I said slowly, "what did you think I meant?" My mother's expression shifted from confusion to discomfort. "We thought you were just, I don't know, trying to be involved somehow. You kept talking about helping with the planning, but we already had everything under control with Michael, so we just—" She trailed off, perhaps realizing how dismissive she sounded. "So you just humored me," I finished for her, a cold clarity settling over me. "You let me think I was helping while completely ignoring everything I said I was doing." "It wasn't like that," my father interjected, but his tone lacked conviction. "We appreciated your interest, but this was our event to plan. We didn't want me to take over," I said, echoing my mother's words from our phone call. "That's what you said, Mom, that I always take over, that I make everything about me." The silence that followed was damning. My parents looked at each other again, some wordless exchange passing between them that excluded me entirely. "Emma," my mother finally said, her voice gentler now, "you have to understand. Ever since you were a little girl, you've always tried to manage things, to fix things, sometimes when people don't ask for your help." "And that's a bad thing?" I asked, genuinely bewildered, wanting to help the people I love. "Not bad," my father said carefully. Just overwhelming sometimes. This anniversary is important to us. We wanted to do it our way, without your interference, I supplied, the word bitter on my tongue. Input, he corrected, though we all knew it was a euphemism. I took a deep breath, struggling to understand their perspective. So, when I mentioned helping with the grand, you just… what? Pretended to listen? Pretended to appreciate my updates? My mother had the grace to look embarrassed. We thought… You were just being, Emma, enthusiastic, wanting to be involved. We didn't realize you were actually arranging everything yourself. Or paying for it, my father added, looking troubled as he studied the payment receipts again. Emma, this is a lot of money. I know exactly how much it is, I said quietly. It was my entire savings, the money I was putting aside for a down payment on a condo. The shock on their faces might have been satisfying under different circumstances. Now it just made me tired. Why would you do that? My mother asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Why would you spend your savings on our anniversary? The question hit me like a slap. Why indeed? The answer had seemed so obvious to me when I'd made the decision, but now, faced with their bewilderment, I found myself struggling to articulate it. Because you're my parents, I said finally, my voice small. Because you've given me everything. Because I wanted to do something meaningful for you, to show you how much I appreciate all the sacrifices you've made for me. Another silence fell, this one heavier than before. My father rubbed his hand across his face, a gesture I recognized from my childhood, what he did when he was deeply troubled. Emma, he said slowly, we never wanted or expected you to repay us. That's not how parenthood works. I know that, I said, frustration building again. It wasn't about repayment. It was about gratitude, about celebration, about doing something special for the two people who mean the most to me in the world. My mother's expression softened slightly, but the wariness remained. And we appreciate that sentiment, truly. But don't you see how this looks from our perspective? We're planning our own celebration, making our own arrangements, and all the while you're secretly planning a different celebration, making decisions without consulting us, spending money we would never have wanted you to spend. Put that way, I could begin to see how my actions might have appeared presumptuous, even controlling. But the hurt was still too fresh, the rejection too raw. So what happens now? I asked, gesturing to the document spread across the counter. I've paid for an entire celebration at the Grand. You've apparently booked something at the Riverside Manor. We have 2 different anniversary parties planned for the same day. My parents exchanged yet another look, and I fought the urge to scream at being excluded from their silent conversation. We'll pay you back, my father said firmly. Every cent. It might take some time, but I don't want your money, I interrupted, the very suggestion making me feel sick. That's not what this is about. Then what do you want, Emma? My mother asked, and there was genuine confusion in her voice, as if she truly couldn't understand my motivation or my hurt. I stared at her, at both of them, these people who had raised me, who I thought knew me better than anyone. I want to know why you wouldn't want me involved in your anniversary beyond being just another guest. I want to understand why my desire to do something special for you is seen as taking over, rather than as an act of love. The silence that followed my question stretched painfully. My mother looked away, her discomfort evident. It was my father, who finally spoke, his voice careful but direct. Emma, you've always been intense about family occasions. Even when you were little, you'd take charge, insisting things had to be a certain way. Remember your mother's 50th birthday? You planned that surprise party down to the minute. Got upset when people didn't follow your schedule exactly. I remembered. I'd been 22, just out of college, eager to create a perfect celebration for my mother. Some of the guests had arrived late, disrupting the carefully orchestrated surprise moment. I'd been visibly disappointed, though I'd tried to hide it. Or your cousin Lisa's wedding, my mother added, gaining confidence. When you redesigned her seating chart the night before because you thought your arrangement made more sense. Another memory I'd apparently remembered very differently than they had. I'd stayed up until 3 a.m. helping Lisa revise her seating chart after her maid of honor dropped out unexpectedly, necessitating last-minute changes. At least, that's how I'd recalled it. Those were different, I protested weakly. I was trying to help. And that's what you're always doing, my father said gently. Always trying to help, to fix, to improve. But sometimes, Emma, people want to do things their own way, even if it's not the way you think is best. His words landed like stones, heavy and immovable. Was that really how they saw me? As someone who couldn't let people do things their own way? Who always had to control and improve and fix? This anniversary is important to us, my mother said, her voice softer now. We wanted to plan it ourselves, to create exactly the celebration we envisioned. Can you understand that? I could, in theory. But what I couldn't understand was why my involvement was seen as a threat rather than a contribution. Why they'd rather pretend to listen to my updates than tell me honestly that they wanted to handle everything themselves. You could have just told me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. When I first offered to help, you could have said, thanks, but we want to do this our way. Instead, you let me think I was helping while completely ignoring everything I said I was doing. Do you have any idea how that feels? The guilt that flashed across their faces gave me a momentary, hollow satisfaction. You're right, my father admitted. We should have been more direct. We just didn't want to hurt your feelings. So instead, you excluded me from your real plans and sent me a formal invitation like I'm just some distant acquaintance, I said, the hurt bubbling up again. How is that better? Another uncomfortable silence fell. I gathered the documents from the counter and returned them to the folder, suddenly exhausted by the whole situation. I need to know what you want to do about the grant, I said, all emotion drained from my voice. I've paid for everything. It's non-refundable at this point. If you want to cancel your plans at the Riverside Manor and use what I've arranged, you can. If not, I'll figure something out. My parents looked at each other, clearly conflicted. It was my mother who spoke first. Emma, we can't let you lose all that money. Of course, we'll use what you've arranged at the Grand. It should have felt like a victory, but it didn't. It felt like pity, like obligation, the exact opposite of what I'd wanted to create. Fine, I said flatly. I'll let Vanessa know you'll be in contact directly from now on. All the details are in the folder. I turned to leave, too emotionally exhausted to continue the conversation. Emma, wait, my father called after me. What about you? Will you still come to the celebration? I paused at the kitchen doorway, not turning around. Why should I? I asked, echoing my mother's question from our phone call. Why should you? Invite me? The silence that followed was answer enough. I walked out of the house without looking back, the carefully constructed facade of our perfect family relationship crumbling with each step. Back in my rental car, I sat staring at my parents' house, the home I'd grown up in, now somehow foreign and unwelcoming. The midday sun cast harsh shadows across the familiar facade, highlighting imperfections I'd never noticed before. Peeling paint near the eaves, a crack in one of the front steps, the slightly crooked mailbox. Imperfections. Maybe that was the problem. I'd spent my life trying to create perfect moments, perfect celebrations, perfect relationships. I'd been so focused on what could be improved that I'd missed what was already good enough. But was that really it? Was I truly the controlling perfectionist they described? Or was there something else at play, some deeper disconnect between how I saw myself and how they saw me? As I started the car and pulled away from the curb, a memory surfaced unexpectedly. My 10th birthday party. My mother had planned a backyard celebration with a handful of friends, a simple cake, a few games. I'd been thrilled with every aspect of it until one of my friends had mentioned her recent party with a bouncy castle and professional face painter. In that moment, I'd felt the first sting of comparison, the first hint that what we had might not be enough. I'd never told my parents about that moment, had never expressed any disappointment with the lovely party they'd created. But something had shifted in me that day. A determination had taken root. A promise to myself that when it came to celebrating the people I loved, I would always go above and beyond. No one in my orbit would ever feel the way I had in that moment, wondering if what they had was enough. Had that childhood resolution shaped my approach to every celebration since? Had my attempts to create perfect, extraordinary moments for my loved ones actually been about addressing my own insecurities rather than their desires? The realization was uncomfortable, a prickly sensation beneath my skin. If there was truth to it, and I suspected there was, then perhaps my parents' reaction wasn't entirely unreasonable. Perhaps my grand gesture wasn't solely about honoring them, but also about satisfying some deep-seated need within myself, to prove that I could create something spectacular, something beyond ordinary. But even if that was partially true, it didn't excuse their dismissal of my efforts, their decision to exclude me from their real plans while pretending to value my input. It didn't explain why they would rather have me as just another guest than as an integral part of their celebration. I checked into a hotel downtown, not yet ready to return to Portland, but unable to stay in my childhood home with the tension so thick between us. That night, alone in the anonymous hotel room, I called Vanessa and explained the situation. The miscommunication, the parallel planning, my parents' decision to use the grand after all. "I'm so sorry, Emma," she said, genuine sympathy in her voice. "Family celebrations can be complicated. Would you like me to refund your payments now that your parents will be taking over?" The question caught me off guard. I hadn't even considered that possibility. "Can you do that? I thought everything was non-refundable at this point." "Technically, yes," she admitted, "but given the circumstances, I might be able to make an exception. Or at least partial refunds for elements we haven't fully committed to yet." I considered it briefly, the practical part of my brain noting how helpful those funds would be in rebuilding my savings. But something in me resisted. "No," I said finally. "Keep the payments as they are." This was my gift to them, even if it didn't work out the way I intended. After hanging up, I lay on the hotel bed staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the day's revelations. The hurt was still there, a persistent ache in my chest, but it was now tempered with something else. A dawning recognition that perhaps this situation wasn't as black and white as it had first appeared. My phone buzzed with a text message. My father. We love you, Emma. Please don't leave things like this. Simple words, but they opened a floodgate of emotion I'd been trying to contain. Tears streamed down my face as I typed and deleted multiple responses, unable to find words that captured the complex mix of hurt, anger, love, and confusion swirling within me. Finally, I settled on, I love you both too, but I need some time. His response came immediately. We understand. When you're ready, we'll be here. I set the phone aside, allowing myself to truly feel the pain of the situation for the first time since the initial shock. It hurt. The rejection, the miscommunication, the realization that perhaps I wasn't the person I thought I was. But beneath the hurt was something else, something steadier, the undeniable fact that despite everything, we loved each other. That had to count for something. As I drifted toward an exhausted sleep, one question remained unanswered, floating, in the darkness behind my closed eyes. Where did we go from here? How could we bridge the gap between their perception and mine, between what I'd intended and how it had been received? The answer wouldn't come that night, but as consciousness faded, I held on to one certainty. This wasn't the end of our story. Difficult as it might be, we would find a way forward, even if the path looked nothing like the one I'd imagined. I spent the next morning wandering the familiar streets of Minneapolis, retracing paths from my childhood with new eyes. The coffee shop where I'd studied for my high school exams. The park where my father had taught me to ride a bike. The library where my mother had introduced me to her favorite novels. I saw these places now not just as landmarks in my own story, but as pieces of my parents' lives. Lives that had existed before me and would continue in ways I might not fully understand. By noon, I found myself at the Riverside Manor, the venue my parents had actually been planning to use before our confrontation. It was beautiful in its own way. Smaller than the Grand, more intimate, with a garden that overlooked a gentle bend in the Mississippi River. Standing at the wrought iron gate, I could understand why they had chosen it. It reflected something essential about them, about their relationship, unpretentious, genuine, with a quiet beauty that didn't announce itself but revealed itself gradually, like their love for each other. Can I help you? A voice interrupted my thoughts. A man in his early 40s with kind eyes and a professional demeanor stood in the garden path. No, I was just looking, I replied, turning to leave. Are you considering us for an event? He persisted. I'd be happy to show you around. I'm Michael Thompson, the events director. Michael. My parents' Michael. I hesitated, then made a split-second decision. Actually, yes, I'm Emma Bennett. My parents, Diana and Marcus Bennett, were planning their 30th anniversary celebration. Here, recognition dawned in his eyes. Oh, the Bennetts. Lovely couple. They called yesterday to cancel their reservation. Said they had a family situation come up. He looked at me more closely. Are you their daughter? They mentioned you once or twice during our planning sessions. They had mentioned me. I wasn't sure why that simple fact affected me so deeply, but it did. Yes, that's me. Michael gestured toward the garden. Would you like to see what we had planned for them? They were quite specific about certain details. Your mother especially had a vision for how everything should look. I nodded, suddenly desperate to understand what they had been creating, what their true vision had been before my intervention forced them to abandon it. For the next hour, Michael showed me through the Riverside Manor, describing in detail the celebration my parents had designed. It was both smaller and more personal than what I had arranged at the Grand. Instead of the formal sit-down dinner, for 50 guests I had planned, they had envisioned a more casual garden party for 30 close friends and family. Rather than the professional string quartet I had hired, they had booked a jazz trio that played the songs popular when they first met. And in place of the elaborate floral arrangements I had selected, they had chosen simple centerpieces featuring flowers from my mother's garden. Most revealing of all were the personal touches they had planned: a display of photos from their 30 years together, a renewal of vows in the garden at sunset, handwritten notes for each guest explaining what that person's friendship had meant to their marriage. These weren't the choices of people who wanted an impressive, spectacular event. These were the choices of two people who wanted to celebrate their love authentically, surrounded by those who had witnessed and supported their journey. Your parents put a lot of thought into every detail, Michael said as we concluded the key tour. It's unusual to see couples so aligned in their vision. Often one spouse takes the lead, but your parents seem to make every decision together. Together. The word resonated painfully. My parents had created this celebration together, while I had imposed my vision entirely on my own. Thank you for showing me, I said, my voice thick with emotion. It helps me understand. If you don't mind my asking, Michael said hesitantly, what was the family situation that caused them to cancel? They seemed so excited about the celebration. I considered how to answer. What explanation would make sense without revealing the messy truth? But in that moment, honesty felt like the only option. I happened, I said simply. I tried to create a different celebration for them without their knowledge. When everything came to light, they chose to use what I had arranged because I'd already paid for it, but I gestured around at the Riverside Manor. This is what they really wanted. Michael's expression shifted from confusion to understanding. Ah, that explains it. Explains what? Why they seemed conflicted when they called to cancel. Your father especially. He kept saying they were doing the right thing, but didn't sound convinced. His words settled heavily in my chest. They had abandoned their vision out of obligation to me, to the money I had spent. Not because they preferred what I had created, but because they felt they had no choice. I thanked Michael and left, my mind racing with new understanding and a germ of an idea beginning to form. Back at my hotel, I made a series of phone calls, first to Vanessa at the Grand, then to my bank, and finally, after gathering my courage, to my parents. Can we meet? I asked when my father answered. There's something I need to discuss with you both. 2 hours later, I sat across from them in their living room, the tension from our previous confrontation still palpable but tempered now with a cautious openness. I visited the Riverside Manor today, I began, watching their expressions carefully. I met Michael. He showed me what you had planned. My mother's eyes widened in surprise. My father leaned forward slightly, his posture tense. Why did you go there? My mother asked. Because I needed to understand, I replied honestly. I needed to see what you had envisioned for yourselves before I interfered. They exchanged a glance, that silent communication again, but this time I didn't resent it. I recognized it for what it was, the shorthand of two people who had built a life together, who knew each other's thoughts sometimes before they were even fully formed. And what did you think? My father asked cautiously. I think it was perfect, I said, the admission both painful and freeing. Perfect for you both, in a way that what I arranged at the Grand could never be. The surprise on their faces might have been comical in other circumstances. Emma, my mother began, clearly unsure how to respond. Please let me finish, I said. I've been thinking a lot about why I did what I did, secretly arranging this elaborate celebration without consulting you, and I realized something important. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to maintain eye contact despite the vulnerability of the moment. It wasn't really about you, not entirely. It was about me, about how I see myself in relation to you. My father's brow furrowed in confusion. I'm not sure I understand. All my life I've defined myself partly through what I can do for others, especially you two. The perfect daughter who anticipates needs, who goes above and beyond, who creates special moments. I shook my head, still coming to terms with this realization myself. But somewhere along the way, I started confusing doing things for people with actually seeing them, seeing what they truly want, not what I think they should want. My mother's expression softened, a glimmer of recognition in her eyes. When I saw what you had planned at the Riverside Manor, I continued, I realized that I never really asked what would make your anniversary special for you. I assumed I knew better. That's not love. That's control, wrapped in good intentions. The admission hung in the air between us, raw and honest. Emma, my father said gently, you've always had a generous heart. Even as a child, you were the first to offer help, to try to make things better for everyone around you. But sometimes, my mother added carefully, your help can feel like you don't trust us to manage on our own, like you need to fix or improve everything we do. The observation stung, but I recognized the truth in it. I'm beginning to see that. And I'm sorry. Not just for the anniversary confusion, but for all the times I've overstepped while thinking I was helping. My parents exchanged another look, this one tinged with surprise and what might have been relief. That said, I continued, I think you both have some responsibility here too. Instead of being honest with me about your plans, you let me believe I was helping while completely ignoring what I said I was doing. That wasn't fair or respectful. My father nodded, accepting the criticism. You're right. We should have been direct from the beginning. We were trying to avoid conflict, but ended up creating something much worse. We've always found it difficult to say no to you, my mother admitted. Even when you were little, you were so determined, so sure of your vision. Sometimes it seemed easier to work around you than to confront you directly. Her words revealed a pattern I hadn't fully recognized before. My forceful helping, their conflict avoidance, a dance we'd been performing for decades without acknowledging the steps. Well, that stops now, I said firmly. I need you both to be honest with me, even when it's uncomfortable, even when you think I might be hurt or disappointed. And I'll try to actually ask what you want before jumping in with my own plans. They nodded, the agreement simple but profound. Now, I said, reaching for my purse and withdrawing an envelope. I have a proposal about the anniversary celebration. I placed the envelope on the coffee table between us. My father picked it up, looking at me questioningly. Open it, I encouraged. Inside was a check, the partial refund Vanessa had managed to secure from the Grand after I explained the situation, in full, along with some funds I had pulled from my emergency account. What is this? My father asked, though the question was clearly rhetorical. "It's enough to cover the cost of rebooking your celebration at the Riverside Manor," I explained. "I've already spoken with Michael. He can still fit you in on your original date if you decide today." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. "Emma, we can't take this. You've already spent so much." "Please," I interrupted. "Let me do this one last thing. Not to control the situation, but to fix what I broke. You should have the anniversary celebration you actually want, not the one obligation forced you to accept." My father looked at the check, then at me, conflict evident in his expression. "But what about the grand? The arrangements you made? The money you've already spent that can't be refunded?" I had anticipated this question. "I have a plan for that too. The partial refund helped, and as for the rest..." I took another deep breath. "I'm going to use the venue and arrangements I booked to host a charity fundraiser for the literacy program Mom volunteered with for years. I've already spoken with their executive director, and they're thrilled with the opportunity. It won't be on your anniversary date. I've arranged to move it to the following weekend, but it will ensure the resources don't go to waste." My parents stared at me, clearly stunned by this solution. "You would do that?" my mother asked softly. "Give up everything you planned and paid for?" "It's not giving up," I corrected her. "It's redirecting. What matters isn't the specific celebration but the love behind it. This way, that love can benefit both you and a cause you care about." Tears filled my mother's eyes, not the reaction I had expected. "All these years," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "we've worried about your need to control things, to make everything perfect. But this shows a wisdom and generosity we didn't fully appreciate." My father reached for my hand across the coffee table. "We're proud of you, Emma. Not for the grand gestures or the perfect plans, but for this, for your willingness to let go, to see beyond your own vision." Their approval warmed me, but I recognized the danger in accepting it too readily, in falling back into old patterns of seeking validation through what I could do for them. "Thank you," I said simply. "But this isn't about making you proud. It's about learning to love people as they are, not as I think they should be. It's a lesson I'm still working on." My mother nodded, understanding in her eyes. "We all are, sweetheart. Every day." We spent the next hour talking more openly than we had in years, about the patterns in our relationship, about the miscommunications and assumptions that had brought us to this point. It wasn't always comfortable, but it felt necessary, like lancing a wound to allow healing to begin. Eventually, the conversation turned back to practical matters. "So," I said, "will you rebook at the Riverside Manor? Have the celebration you really want?" My parents looked at each other, another silent exchange passing between them. My father nodded slightly, and my mother turned to me. "Yes," she said. "If you're sure about this, we will." "I am," I assured her. "It's what you deserve." My father picked up the check again, studying it thoughtfully. "On one condition," he said finally. "What's that?" "That you'll be there, not just as a guest, but as an integral part of the celebration. We want you to do a reading during the vow renewal, something you choose that reflects your perspective on our marriage." The invitation was unexpected. A bridge extended across the divide that had opened between us. "Are you sure?" I asked. "You don't have to include me in that way just because..." "We're sure," my mother interrupted firmly. You're our daughter, our only child, the person who has witnessed our relationship more intimately than anyone else. Your perspective matters to us. I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. Then yes, I'd be honored. As I left their house that evening, something had shifted between us, not magically healed but realigned, like a fracture properly set and beginning the slow process of knitting back together. Back at my hotel, I sent a flurry of emails to Michael at the Riverside Manor confirming my parents would be rebooking, to Vanessa at the Grand finalizing details for the charity event, to my boss explaining I'd need a few more days in Minneapolis. Then I opened my laptop and began researching readings for marriage vow renewals, determined to find something that would honor my parents' relationship while acknowledging its complexity and resilience. An hour into my search, I received a text message from my mother. Your father and I have been talking. We'd like you to help us with some aspects of the Riverside Manor planning. Not to take over, but to collaborate. Your eye for detail and your creativity are gifts we'd be foolish to reject completely, if you're interested. I read the message 3 times, recognizing the significance of what she was offering. Not carte blanche to impose my vision, but a genuine invitation to contribute within boundaries. It was, in its way, the most respectful form of inclusion they could extend. I'd like that, I texted back. But promise you'll tell me honestly if any of my suggestions don't feel right. For you. Her response came quickly. We promise, no more avoiding difficult conversations. I smiled, feeling something settle within me, a recognition that true generosity wasn't about grand gestures or perfect execution, but about seeing people clearly and respecting their autonomy, even when their choices differed from what I would have chosen for them. The next morning, I met my parents at the Riverside Manor to finalize their rebooking. Michael greeted us warmly, clearly pleased to have them back as clients. As he guided us through the garden, pointing out where the vow renewal would take place, where the jazz trio would set up, where the photo display would stand, I watched my parents, the way they leaned into each other, the small touches and glances they exchanged, the shared excitement evident in their expressions. This was what I had wanted to honor all along, I realized, not with an extravagant event at the Grand, but with genuine recognition of the love they had built together. A love that had shaped me, even when I didn't fully understand it. What do you think, Emma? My father asked, gesturing to a trellis arch where they planned to stand for their vow renewal. Do you think we should add some additional flowers, or keep it simple? The question was genuine, an invitation to contribute, without expectation that my answer would override their preferences. I think simple is beautiful, I replied honestly. The focus should be on you two, not the decorations. My mother smiled, squeezing my father's hand. That's what I said too. The moment was small but significant. A harmony reached not through my controlling the outcome or them dismissing my input, but through genuine alignment, a shared vision arrived at independently. As we continued the tour, I found myself offering suggestions occasionally, but always as options rather than directives. Have you considered? Instead of, you should. Some ideas they embraced enthusiastically, others they considered and gently declined. Each interaction felt balanced in a way our previous dynamics rarely had been. After finalizing details with Michael, we had lunch at a cafe overlooking the river. The conversation flowed easily, touching on the upcoming celebration but also ranging to other topics, my work in Portland, their retirement plans, books we'd recently read. It felt normal, comfortable, the tension of the past few days receding, though not entirely gone. As we were finishing our meal, my mother reached across the table and took my hand. "I want you to know something, Emma. Your father and I have been talking about why we were so resistant to your involvement in our anniversary plans, and we realized it wasn't just about your tendency to take charge." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "Part of it was our own insecurity," she admitted. "We worried that whatever we planned wouldn't be as impressive or special as what you would create. You've always had such a flair for these things, such high standards. Without meaning to, you can make people feel inadequate by comparison." The observation hit me with unexpected force. I had never considered that my parents, these pillars of confidence and capability in my life, might feel intimidated by me. "I never meant to make you feel that way," I said quietly. "We know," my father assured me. "But intentions and impact aren't always aligned. Just as we need to be more direct with you instead of avoiding conflict, perhaps you could be more mindful of how your enthusiasm might affect others." I nodded, absorbing this new perspective. "I'll try. I'm beginning to see how what I thought was helpful could actually undermine people's confidence in their own abilities." "It's a balance," my mother said thoughtfully. "Your drive and attention to detail are strengths, Emma. They've helped you succeed in your career, in your relationships. We're not asking you to dimple those qualities, just to be more conscious of when they might overwhelm others. And we need to be better about speaking up," my father added, "rather than retreating and working around you." It was, I realized, a perfect summation of the lesson we were all learning, that love required both assertion and yielding, both offering and receiving, both action and restraint. That sometimes the most generous thing you could do for someone was not to fix or improve or manage, but simply to witness and affirm. As we left the cafe, my mother linked her arm through mine, a gesture of affection she hadn't initiated in years. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" "For helping us have the anniversary we truly want. For listening when it would have been easier to defend yourself. For turning what could have been a permanent breach in our relationship into an opportunity for growth." Her gratitude warmed me, all the more meaningful because it acknowledged not what I had done, but who I was becoming. Someone capable of stepping back, of letting go, of loving without controlling. "I've been thinking," I said as we walked toward our cars, "about what reading to do at your vow renewal." "Have you found something?" my father asked. "Not yet," I admitted. "But I've been reflecting on what I've observed in your marriage. Over the years, what I've learned from watching you together. And I think what stands out most is your resilience. The way you've faced challenges together, adapted, grown. The way you've given each other space to change while remaining connected." My mother squeezed my arm. "That's insightful, Emma. And speaks to what we're all working on now, doesn't it? That balance between togetherness and independence." I nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. "I think I need to write something original for the reading, something that honors that specific quality in your relationship." "We would love that," my father said, genuine emotion in his voice. As I drove back to my hotel later that afternoon, I felt a sense of possibility opening before me. Not just for my parents' anniversary celebration, but for our relationship moving forward. We had named the patterns that had constrained us, had begun the difficult work of creating new ones. There would be missteps ahead, I knew. Old habits wouldn't disappear overnight. I would still sometimes overreach. They would still sometimes withdraw rather than confront. But we had created a new awareness, a shared language for recognizing and addressing these patterns when they emerged. In my hotel room, I opened my notebook and began drafting thoughts for the vow renewal reading, reflecting on what I had witnessed in my parents' marriage and what I was learning about love in my own life. The words came slowly at first, then, with increasing flow as I allowed myself to write from a place of observation rather than prescription, of appreciation rather than improvement. When my phone rang, I answered without checking the caller ID, still absorbed in my writing. "Emma Bennett?" an unfamiliar voice asked. "Yes?" "This is Serena Wilson from the Minneapolis Literacy Coalition. I wanted to thank you personally for your incredible generosity in hosting the fundraiser at the Grand. Our executive director told me what you're doing, and I was moved to call you directly." I smiled, surprised by how good it felt to be appreciated for a gesture that had begun as a problem-solving necessity rather than a planned act of charity. "I'm happy to help," I said sincerely. "My mother volunteered with your organization for years. The work you do is important." "Would you be willing to say a few words at the event?" Serena asked. "About your connection to literacy work through your mother? It would add a personal touch that I think would resonate with our donors." My instinct was to immediately agree, to begin planning the perfect speech, to take control of yet another aspect of the event. But I paused, mindful of my recent insights. "I'd be honored," I said after a moment, "but I'd like to keep it simple and brief. The focus should be on your organization and the people you serve, not on me." "Of course," Serena agreed. "Just a few minutes would be wonderful." After we hung up, I returned to my writing, struck by how this situation had evolved, from a misguided attempt to control my parents' anniversary to a genuine opportunity to contribute to a cause they cared about. From imposing my vision to supporting others in realizing theirs. It wasn't the outcome I had imagined when I first contacted the Grand months ago, but it was, in many ways, more meaningful. Not because of the scale or impressiveness of the gestures involved, but because of the growth they represented. In me, in my relationship with my parents, in my understanding of what it truly meant to give. As I wrote, a line came to me that seemed to capture this insight perfectly. The greatest gift we can offer those we love is not perfection, but presence. Not managing their lives, but witnessing them. Not improving their choices, but honoring them. I wrote it down, knowing it would find its way into both the vow renewal reading and my brief speech at the literacy fundraiser. It was, in its essence, the lesson I needed to carry forward. That true generosity began not with grand plans or perfect execution, but with the simple, profound act of seeing people as they were and loving them exactly there. 3 weeks passed in a flurry of collaborative planning. I extended my stay in Minneapolis, working remotely during the days and spending evenings with my parents, helping finalize details for their Riverside Manor celebration, while simultaneously organizing the literacy fundraiser at the Grand. The way. Dual projects became a laboratory for practicing my new awareness, learning when to offer suggestions and when to listen, when to take charge and when to step back. With the Literacy Coalition, I found they welcomed my organizational skills and attention to detail, areas where they needed support. With my parents, I practiced restraint, offering ideas only when asked and accepting without argument when they chose different options than I would have. It wasn't always easy. Old habits surfaced regularly, the urge to override others' preferences with what I was certain would be better. The instinctive rush to fix problems before they'd even fully formed. The slight disappointment when things weren't done exactly as I would have done them. But with each small choice to pause, to check my assumptions, to genuinely consider others' perspectives, I felt something shifting within me, a loosening of control that paradoxically left me feeling more grounded rather than less. The morning of my parents' anniversary dawned clear and perfect, the June sunlight filtering through the trees surrounding the riverside manor with a golden glow that seemed auspicious. I arrived early, as agreed, to help with the final preparations. My mother was already there, arranging the photo display that chronicled their 30 years together. I paused at the entrance to the garden, taking a moment to simply observe her. The careful way she positioned each frame, the slight tilt of her head as she considered the arrangement, the soft smile that played across her lips as she lingered over certain images. She hadn't noticed me yet, and there was something precious about witnessing this private moment of reflection and joy. "Need any help?" I asked finally, approaching with deliberate casualness, careful not to disrupt her process. She turned, her smile widening. "Emma, I was just finishing up. What do you think?" I examined the display, genuinely impressed by her eye for composition. The photos were arranged not chronologically but thematically, moments of adventure alongside moments of quiet intimacy, professional milestones next to family celebrations, the entire arc of their relationship captured with thoughtfulness and artistry. "It's beautiful, Mom," I said sincerely. "You've created something really special here." The pride in her expression was unmistakable. "Thank you. I wanted it to tell our story, not just show a timeline." In that moment, I recognized something I had often overlooked: my mother's own creativity and aesthetic sense, different from mine but no less valid or sophisticated. How many times had I rushed in to improve her efforts, never pausing to appreciate what she had already created? "You have a great eye," I said, the compliment straightforward and genuine. "I love how you've grouped these themes together." She looked pleased, but slightly surprised, as if unaccustomed to having her creative choices affirmed rather than adjusted. I've always enjoyed visual storytelling. In another life, maybe I would have been a curator or an art director. It was a glimpse into a side of her I had rarely considered, her dreams beyond motherhood and teaching, the paths she might have explored in different circumstances. I found myself curious in a new way, interested not in how I might guide or help her, but in simply knowing her more fully. "Tell me more about that," I said, sitting on a nearby bench, genuinely interested. "What kind of art speaks to you?" The conversation that followed revealed dimensions of my mother I had either never known or had forgotten in my rush to define our relationship primarily through what I could do for her. We talked about her college interest in art history, her brief internship at a gallery before she committed to education, the visual elements that still drew her eye decades later. "Your father never quite understood this part of me," she admitted with a small laugh. "He's so practical, so linear in his thinking, but he's always supported it, made space for it in our life together." "That's love, isn't it?" I observed. "Making space for the parts of each other that you might not fully understand." She looked at me with a new expression, not the maternal pride I was familiar with, but something closer to peer recognition, as if seeing me as a fellow adult with insights of my own. "Yes," she agreed simply. "That's exactly what it is." My father arrived shortly after, bringing with him the jazz trio who would play during the celebration. As they set up in the corner of the garden, he joined us by the photo display, slipping his arm around my mother's waist with the easy affection of long practice. "Beautiful work, Dee," he said, surveying the arrangement. Then, to me, "Your mother has always had an artist's eye." "I was just learning about that," I replied, exchanging a smile with my mother. "There's a lot I'm still discovering." The guests began arriving at 4, a smaller group than would have attended the event at the Grand, but clearly chosen with care. Each person who entered the garden was greeted personally by both my parents, their genuine pleasure at each arrival evident. I watched from a slight distance, helping direct people to the refreshment table or the guest book, but careful not to insert myself into the center of their hosting role. As the garden filled with conversation and laughter, I found myself approached by my mother's oldest friend, Judith, whom I had known my entire life. "Emma," she said warmly, embracing me. "This is wonderful. Your parents must be so pleased with how it's all come together." "It's all their vision," I replied, meaning it completely. "They created exactly what they wanted." Judith gave me a knowing look. "With some help from you, I hear. Your mother told me about the situation with the 2 venues. How you found a way to make everything work out." I shrugged, slightly uncomfortable with the implied praise. "I just fixed a problem I created in the first place." "That's not how Diana tells it," Judith said. "She says you showed remarkable grace and generosity, that you turned what could have been a disaster into something meaningful for everyone." Her words warmed me, not because they credited me with saving the day, but because they suggested my mother had seen and valued the change in my approach, the effort to support rather than control. "We all learned something important," I said simply. Judith nodded, a wisdom in her eyes that came from decades of friendship with my parents. "You know, I've watched you grow up, Emma. You were always such a determined child, smart, capable, eager to make your mark. But there's a different kind of strength in what you did here, in being willing to step back, to let your parents lead in their own celebration. That's a kind of maturity that's rarer than you might think." Before I could respond, the jazz trio began playing a gentle rendition of "The Way You Look Tonight," my parents' song from their wedding day. The conversations around the garden quieted as my father led my mother to the small area designated as a dance floor. They moved together with the comfort of 3 decades' practice, my father's hand resting lightly at the small of my mother's back, her head tilting naturally to rest against his shoulder. There was nothing showy or dramatic about their dance, yet it held a beauty that caught the throat, the beauty of lasting love, of 2 people who had weathered life's complexities together and emerged still choosing each other, still finding joy in simple connection. As the song progressed, other couples joined them on the dance floor, but my attention remained fixed on my parents. I had spent months planning what I thought would be the perfect celebration of their marriage, yet nothing I could have arranged at the Grand would have captured the essence of their relationship as powerfully as this unorchestrated moment in a garden they had chosen themselves. Later, as the evening light began to soften, my father clinked his glass to gather everyone's attention. The guests formed a loose semicircle around the trellis arch where my parents would renew their vows. "Thank you all for being here," my father began, his voice steady but touched with emotion. "Diana and I are grateful to have you witness this milestone with us. 30 years ago, we made promises to each other that we've spent 3 decades trying to keep, sometimes succeeding, sometimes stumbling, but always committed to the attempt." My mother took his hand, her smile intimate and knowing. "Before we renew those promises," my father continued, We've asked our daughter, Emma, to share some thoughts. Emma has had a unique perspective on our relationship, watching it evolve throughout her life. We're honored that she agreed to put that perspective into words for us today. He gestured toward me, and I moved to stand beside them, unfolding the paper where I had written my reading. Looking out at the gathered friends and family, then back at my parents, I felt a surge of gratitude for this moment. Not because I had orchestrated it, but precisely because I hadn't. Because I had been invited into it authentically, asked to contribute in a way that honored both their vision and my relationship to them. When I was asked to share some thoughts about my parents' marriage, I began, I found myself thinking, not about grand romantic gestures or dramatic declarations of love, but about everyday moments. Moments that might seem unremarkable unless you understood what they represented. I glanced at my parents, drawing strength from their encouraging expressions. I thought about how my father, who treasures his morning routine and early solitude, learned to make my mother's coffee exactly as she likes it, bringing it to her each morning for 30 years because she's never been a morning person. How my mother, who came from a family that never discussed emotions, taught herself to speak the language of feelings because she knew my father needed words, not just actions, to feel secure in her love. I saw recognition in the eyes of those who knew them best, small nods acknowledging these familiar truths. I thought about how they navigated their fundamental differences, my father's practicality and my mother's artistic sensibility, his preference for planning and her love of spontaneity, his introversion and her social nature. How instead of trying to change each other, they created a life that had room for both their ways of being. My mother squeezed my father's hand, a private acknowledgement passing between them. But what stands out most when I reflect on 30 years of witnessing their marriage is this. They have mastered the art of adjustment without resentment, of compromise without sacrifice. They have learned to bend without breaking, to adapt without losing themselves. I took a breath, moving to the heart of what I wanted to convey. In a culture that often romanticizes passion and grand gestures, my parents have shown me that true love exists in the willingness to see each other clearly, flaws, complexities, and all, and to choose each other anyway, day after day. To make space for growth and change while maintaining connection, to hold on and let go in equal measure. I looked directly at them now, allowing my prepared words to give way to what I felt in that moment. Mom, Dad, watching you has taught me that love is not about perfection or control, but about presence and acceptance. Not about creating an ideal version of each other, but about witnessing who you truly are and saying yes to that reality, again and again. Thank you for that lesson. It's one I'm still learning, but having your example makes the path clearer. My voice wavered slightly on the last words. My mother's eyes shone with tears, and my father's expression held a depth of emotion he rarely displayed in public. They both reached for my hands, drawing me into a brief, tight embrace before I stepped back to allow their vow renewal to continue. As they spoke their promises to each other, simple and heartfelt, I felt a profound sense of rightness. Not because everything was perfect according to some external standard, but because it was authentic, a true reflection of who they were, both as individuals and as a couple. The celebration continued into the evening, the intimate gathering taking on the quality of a family dinner that had naturally expanded to include dear friends. I moved throughout the garden, chatting with relatives I hadn't seen in years, dancing with my father's college roommate who had known me since infancy, helping replenish the refreshment table when needed, but always with a conscious lightheartedness, a deliberate absence of management or control. Near the end of the evening, as the jazz trio played their final set and the garden lights twinkled in the early summer darkness, my mother found me sitting alone on a bench near the river's edge. "Mind some company?" she asked, settling beside me without waiting for a response. "Not at all," I replied, smiling at her. "Enjoying your celebration?" "More than I can express," she said, her voice content in a way I hadn't heard in years. It was exactly what we wanted: simple, meaningful, surrounded by people who matter to us. She paused, her next words careful but direct. "I hope you know how much it means to us that you made this possible. Not just financially, though that was incredibly generous, but by being willing to let go of your original vision when you realized it wasn't what we truly wanted." "It wasn't easy," I admitted. "I had to face some uncomfortable truths about myself, about how I sometimes use helping others as a way to maintain control." She nodded, neither arguing with nor affirming my self-assessment directly. "We all have patterns we develop for dealing with the world, ways of being that served us at one point but might need adjustment as we grow. The question is whether we're willing to recognize them and do the hard work of changing when necessary. Like you and Dad have done throughout your marriage," I observed. "Exactly," she agreed. "No relationship lasts 30 years without a lot of self-awareness and adaptation." She looked out at the river, her profile thoughtful in the dim light. "You know, your father and I have been talking about something we'd like to propose." "Oh?" I felt a flicker of my old anxiety, the fear of being excluded, of being kept at a distance, but breathed through it, reminding myself that our relationship was evolving, that trust required patience. "We'd like to contribute to your condo fund," she said, turning back to face me, "to help replace some of what you spent on all of this." The offer caught me completely off guard. "Mom, no. That's not necessary. I chose to use that money. I don't regret it." "We know you don't," she said gently. "That's exactly why we want to do this. Not because we feel obligated, but because we're proud of the person you are. Not just your generosity, but your willingness to grow, to hear difficult feedback, to adapt." I felt tears threatening, unexpected emotion welling up. "I don't know what to say." "You could try thank you," she suggested with a small smile, "and then accept the gift in the spirit it's offered, with love, without strings, as one adult to another." I recognized in her words an invitation to a new phase of our relationship, one based on mutual respect and recognition, rather than the parent-child dynamic that had defined us for so long. One where giving and receiving flowed in both directions, without power struggles or hidden agendas. "Thank you," I said simply. "I accept." She squeezed my hand, satisfaction in her expression. "Good. That's progress for both of us. You learning to receive, me learning to give without managing how the gift is used." We sat in companionable silence for a moment, the sounds of the celebration continuing behind us, the river flowing steadily before us. "Your reading was beautiful," she said eventually. "You captured something essential about our marriage, something I'm not sure I could have articulated myself." "I've had a lifetime to observe it," I replied, even when I didn't fully understand what I was seeing. "That's often how wisdom works," she reflected. "We absorb patterns and truths long before we can name them. Speaking of which," she added, her tone shifting slightly, "how are you feeling about the literacy fundraiser next weekend?" "Good," I said, realizing with some surprise that it was true. It's coming together well. The coalition team has been wonderful to work with, clear about what they need, open to suggestions without expecting me to handle everything. It feels balanced. She nodded, understanding the significance of that word in light of our recent experiences. Balance is what we're all seeking, isn't it? In relationships, in work, in how we move through the world. The equilibrium between giving and receiving, between asserting and yielding, between independence and connection. Exactly, I agreed. And I'm starting to understand that balance isn't static. It's not something you achieve once and then maintain. It's dynamic, constantly shifting, requiring ongoing attention and adjustment. Like a dance, my mother suggested. Or like a marriage. Or like a parent-child relationship that's evolving into an adult friendship, I added. She smiled, genuine pleasure lighting her features. Yes, exactly like that. My father approached then, hand extended toward my mother. May I have this dance, Mrs. Bennet? They're playing our song again. My mother rose, taking his hand with practiced ease. Always, Mr. Bennet. Then, to me, will you join us? There's room for 3. The invitation was simple but profound, an acknowledgement of my place in their celebration, neither centered nor peripheral but integrated, a part of the whole without needing to direct it. I'd like that, I said, rising to join them. As we moved back toward the dance floor, I felt a deep contentment settle over me, not the fierce satisfaction of having executed a perfect plan, but the gentler joy of participation in something authentic and meaningful, of being present without needing to control, of loving people as they were, not as I thought they should be. The week that followed brought its own lessons in this new approach to relationship. As the literacy fundraiser at the Grand approached, I found myself navigating a different kind of collaboration, working with the coalition team to create an event that served their mission rather than my vision of perfection. When the executive director suggested simplifying the menu to redirect funds toward program support, I embraced the change despite my initial resistance. When the marketing coordinator proposed a different room setup than I had envisioned, I listened to her reasoning with genuine openness rather than defensiveness. Each small choice to yield, to consider, to adapt, felt like practice in this new way of being, uncomfortable at times but ultimately freeing. The fundraiser itself became an unexpected capstone to my journey of self-awareness. Standing in the Grand Hotel's Lakeview room, now transformed for a purpose entirely different from what I had originally planned, I felt a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with controlling the outcome and everything to do with serving something larger than myself. When it came time for me to speak briefly about my connection to the Literacy Coalition through my mother, I found myself departing slightly from my prepared remarks, inspired by the energy in the room and the genuine passion of the coalition, staff I had come to know over the past weeks. My mother taught in Minneapolis public schools for 28 years. I began, scanning the room filled with donors, educators, and program participants. But her real gift wasn't just teaching children to read words on a page. It was teaching them to see reading as a doorway to possibility, to imagine themselves into stories and stories into their lives. I paused, struck by the parallel to my own recent journey. In many ways, that's what the Minneapolis Literacy Coalition does every day, helps people see new possibilities for themselves, empowers them to write their own stories, rather than accepting the limitations others might impose. They create space for growth and transformation, for people to become authors of their own lives. I gestured toward the coalition staff seated at the front table. When I offered to host this fundraiser, I thought I was simply solving a logistical problem. What I didn't expect was how much I would learn from working with this remarkable team, about genuine collaboration, about serving a mission larger than myself, about the difference between controlling outcomes and contributing to something meaningful. Looking out at the attentive faces, I felt a sureness I hadn't anticipated. Not the rigid certainty of someone determined to impose their will, but the grounded confidence of someone who had found a truer way to engage with the world. My mother is here tonight, I continued, acknowledging her with a smile. And one of the many gifts she's given me is the understanding that true impact rarely comes from imposing our vision on others, but from creating conditions where people can discover and express their own potential. That's what literacy does. That's what education at its best does. And that's what your support makes possible for thousands of people in our community. The applause that followed felt like affirmation not of my eloquence, but of the truth we all recognized, that our most meaningful contributions often come not from controlling or directing, but from serving and enabling, from making space for others' growth and development. Later that evening, as the fundraiser concluded with the announcement that we had exceeded our financial goal by nearly 20%, I found myself standing at the edge of the room, observing the scene with quiet satisfaction. The coalition team was celebrating. Donors were engaged in animated conversations about future initiatives, and there was a palpable sense of community and shared purpose that no amount of perfect planning could have manufactured. My mother approached, linking her arm through mine in what had become a familiar gesture of affection and connection. "Proud of you," she said simply. "For raising money?" I asked. She shook her head. "For growing. For finding a way to channel all your considerable gifts, your organizational skills, your attention to detail, your drive for excellence, in service of others rather than in control of them. It's been remarkable to witness." Her words touched me deeply, all the more meaningful because they acknowledged not just what I had done, but how I had changed. Not perfect transformation. I was still learning, still catching myself in old patterns, but genuine growth nonetheless. "I had good teachers," I replied, squeezing her arm gently. "We all do if we're paying attention," she said with a smile. "The question is whether we're willing to learn the lessons life keeps offering us." As the evening wound down and the last guest departed, I found myself standing alone in the Lakeview room, the space I had originally reserved for my parents' anniversary, now emptied of its temporary purpose. In that quiet moment, I reflected on the journey of the past months, from my well-intentioned but controlling attempt to create the perfect celebration for my parents, to this unexpected outcome that had enriched all our lives in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The room would be transformed again tomorrow for another event, another gathering of people coming together for their own purposes. My brief tenure as its occupant was ending, yet something permanent had been established. Not in the physical space, but in the internal landscape of my relationships and self-understanding. I had entered this journey believing I was giving a gift to my parents. I was leaving with the recognition that the greater gift had been what the experience taught me, about love that doesn't control, about generosity that doesn't impose, about the freedom that comes from letting go of perfection in favor of authenticity. As I switched off the lights and prepared to leave, a final thought crystallized, one I would carry forward into all my relationships, all my endeavors. True generosity isn't about grand gestures or perfect execution. It's about creating space for others to be fully themselves, to express their own needs and desires, to chart their own course. It's about offering support without expectation, presence without agenda, love without conditions. In the end, the most meaningful answer to my mother's question, "Why should we invite you?" wasn't found in any justification I could offer, but in becoming someone who didn't need to control the invitation, who could receive it with grace when offered and accept its absence when necessary. Someone who understood that belonging comes not from managing others' choices, but from authentic connection, based on mutual respect and recognition. That was the real celebration, the enduring gift, not the anniversary party at the Riverside Manor or the fundraiser at the Grand, but the transformed relationships that would continue long after both events had ended. The new possibilities that had opened up, not just for me but for all of us, as we learned to love each other more truly, more completely, exactly as we were. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.